I'm going to begin, okay? Because we only got till 1:15, and those who join will join whenever. It's just to share some thoughts. You know, we're all, I don't have to express how shocked we all are with this news. Should be, you know, the passing of Rabbi Sachs. Should be the Louis Nishmosei, and that's all we can say, really. You know, our learning tonight should be Louis his neshama. The family should have a neshama. And we're going to. Okay, we're going to begin. Right. So the connection with the parsha. Did everyone have them get the Makoros? Did you manage to print off or get you got them on the screen? Yeah. So So basically, the parsha. The connection is obvious in the parsha. The pasuk says, so therefore, you see that Avram, although it's stretching it a little bit in the sense that he didn't hide his identity as a Jew, but he certainly hid the identity of who his wife was in order to save her. And Rashi points out here in the second source that he didn't ask permission. It was against her will, right? Because he'd already had a previous experience, last week's parsha, when she was taken to Paro. So on this occasion, he didn't even ask permission in the sense that it was clear that was the pathway they needed to follow. But here it is an opening towards this whole question about hiding identity in public. And what we have is a medrash, a very well-known medrash. Interestingly enough, this medrash, which I put here in source 3, is actually it's commonly referred to the medrash, right? We know that in Mitzrayim, the Jews did not change 3 things, yeah, their name and their language, their lashonom, and their dress. It's actually an amalgamation. So there isn't actually one medrash that says all 3 together. There are actually a few midrashim, and if you put the midrashim together, you get to the list. It's interesting that you have, you know, this list has become common parlance. We refer to these 3, but it's actually an amalgamation of midrashim. This medrash says, why is it 3 types of olah? There were 3 midos tovos that the Jewish people had in Mitzrayim, and what were the 3? And the 3 midos that they had, and in the merit of those 3, they were redeemed. And what were those 3? They didn't change their names. They didn't change their language. So here it says that they restricted themselves in terms of immorality. They avoided all forms of immorality. Interestingly enough, on the just to jump straight away to an interesting point of halacha, which is the idea of shinu shmom. So we see that the Klal Yisrael are praised for not changing their names. What is the issue in terms of the issue of Jewish names? There's a very, very, very fascinating machlokas about the status of Jewish names. The Maram Shik apparently was very, very opposed to
I pushed a video of.
Yeah, using secular names, the Maram Shik, and we're talking about surnames, right? And the name Shik, those who still have the name Shik, is Shem Yisrael Kodesh. I didn't know that till I saw this. I didn't realize that was the case. It's fascinating. The name Shik is an abbreviation, Shem Yisrael Kodesh, and therefore anyone who has the surname Shik, there are famous Shiks in America. The Talmud, very close to Baron Kotler. I think he passed away recently. Anyway, he's they apparently always spell it with an abbreviation for that reason. You know, it's a bit like Katz, Cohen, Sedek, and and Siegel is Skulas Levi. You know, it's an abbreviation. The Rogachev apparently holds that if there are names in other languages that are translations of Jewish names, so that's allowed. But he doesn't allow us names that are completely secular. And then you have 2 tshuvos of Ramosha, who says that you find throughout history, it was especially common, we know, in Germany. There were many very great tzaddikim who had secular names as well. And he says it's a milah. That's what it is. You know, it's a higher sort of level. That's what that's the implication of the medrash. And he says, just like people don't always speak Lashon HaKodesh, so people also sometimes don't always adopt Jewish names. And otherwise, he also says elsewhere in another tshuva that we can distinguish ourselves in other ways now through Shmiras HaMitzvos. It's interesting also this debate, because it goes really to the heart of when you have a medrash like that. You know, what impact does it have on, let's call it the halachic process? You know, how much do you take a medrash and put that into, you know, where does it translate, or does it impact on halacha? Separate area, but very, very, very interesting. Let's go through a few of these makoros here. So basically, these are different. Don't know who had a chance to look at them or not, but basically, they are different. They are different makoros here in terms of what are implications as to whether or not one is allowed to hide one's identity as a Jew. The first source, which is the Gemara in Sanhedrin, says that it says the following thing, that when it's before Hesia, there's this idea of a difference between Gezeras Shmad, if there's a time of persecution or not. Time of persecution, then one is not allowed to transgress anything, because that itself means it would be an admission of the capitulation to this situation of religious persecution called Gezeras Shmad or Gezeras Amalchus. But even if it is not such a time of persecution, it's only in private. But in public, the Gemara says even a mitzvah kala, even a very small mitzvah, yehorek va'al yavra, better to be killed than transgress. What is a mitzvah kala? And the Gemara says even to change arkasa de masano, which is basically a shoelace. Rashi explains, I brought Rashi here as well, that basically if you tie it one way, if the general practice to tie a shoelace is one way, and the Jewish practice is a different way, he says in a situation where he calls it sad yadus padova, there's some Jewish relevance to the way you tie your shoes, and the way of derech Yisrael is to be tzonua. Then even this change, which is only a minhag effectively, he should be makadesh shem shomayim. He should be makadesh shem shomayim and not to change. So you take that Gemara at face value. That seems to imply that one has to be extremely careful about changing anything to hide one's identity, to do something in a sort of way that is not Jewish, right? That's the simple explanation of that Gemara. The reality is, though, that there are a number of Gemaras which can be taken it can be understood in another direction, and we will maybe come back to that Gemara, to the first Gemara, in a couple of minutes. The Gemara in the Dorim, Samach Beis Samad Beis, says, Rava says, Shori le'letzuv me'rabbanon, the Talmid Chacham was allowed to say, Avdo d'nura ano, which means I'm the servant of the fire, literally. Now, the servant of the fire worship was very common in ancient, in Zoroastrian Persia, time of the Gemara. And they used to put, it says he's allowed to say he's a fire worshipper, lo yehivna akraga, and therefore he doesn't have to pay taxes. The simple explanation of that Gemara is it's some sort of either illegal tax or overburdensome or unfair or whatever it is. And therefore, my time, what's the reason he's allowed to do so? Lavruchi Aryo Mineka Omar, in order to scare, literally means to scare away a lion. In other words, it's some discriminatory tax against Jews. That's the simple explanation of the Gemara, right? And therefore, in that situation, he's allowed to evade it. It's not problem of Dinah de Malchusa, by basically saying that he is Avda Denura, by denying his Jewish identity. So again, that's the simple shot in the Gemara. There's another Gemara in Avodah Zarah. We'll try and come back to these in a minute. There's another Gemara in Avodah Zarah where the Gemara tells the story of Reb Meir. This is the source 6 on the sheet, where Reb Meir was being chased, and he runs into a Beis Zonus, a brothel, and they run, and there are two explanations of what he does there. Some say that he basically dips his finger in some food that was bishul ovdei kirchovim, that was cooked by a non-Jew, and therefore he dipped one finger in and tasted the other finger. The classic trick. Tomash, that's what it says. It says Tomash Bahar, Mossak Bahar. He dips his finger in with one, and he tastes the other finger. So he tricks them. Another one is that Eliyahu came and appeared like a Zona, and she sort of embraced him. And they said, well, it can't be Reb Meir. It can't possibly be Reb Meir. So again, this also is an implication that in a situation of danger, Reb Meir is hiding his identity. But the Gemara, which is the clearest Gemara about hiding one's identity in public, is actually Yerushalmi and Avodah Zarah. Yerushalmi and Avodah Zarah asked the following question: Why is it that there is a discussion there about yichud? And it says that the concern with yichud, with a woman, is to do with the concern of znus. And the question is, why is there no concern? It says there's no concern about possibly this situation of a bloodthirsty idolater or whatever. Why are we not concerned that he will murder her? Why is that not a concern of the Mishnah in terms of being secluded? Omer Rabbi Ami, as it is with a man, by the way. So Rabbi Ami said, Tipota Bibriya. Rabbi Ami says that it can be referring to a strong woman who will not become endangered, right? I reproduced this in English specifically because I figured that many might have access to the Bavli in English versions of the Gemara, but less the Yerushalmi. So I thought it would be useful to provide the English. But obviously, if there's interest, I can provide more English translations if we're doing sort of home learning. That I can try and do so, make it more accessible. Whatever people want, just please do let me know. Just let me know, right? It's not always possible because sometimes it means literally typing and translating everything. But whatever, if we can provide more, sometimes it's easy to do so. So basically, Rabbi Ami says we can be talking about someone who's a strong woman. So there's no possibility of she's going to become endangered because she's just strong. That's the case. The case is a case where there's no concern of sakana. Rabbi Ovin says, no, it's very simple. He says, you can say we're talking about, you can even say as follows. A woman is able to hide herself and pretend to be a goy. And that's why there's no concern. There's no concern that she will be murdered for being a Jew, right? Because she can hide her identity. A man is impossible to hide his identity and say he's a goy. Why? Simple. Yeah, because he's got bris milah, right? He can't hide himself. A man can never hide his identity. In those days, only Jews basically had bris milah. Depends on the time period, but certainly time of the Gemara, it was not common. It wasn't common as far as I understand at all. There were others who did perform a variety of bris milah, but at the time of the Gemara, as far as I know, it wasn't common, and therefore he would know who's a Jew with a man. So that's why he couldn't hide it, but a woman can. Now there are different ways of understanding this Yerushalmi, but according to the Or Zarua says that this machlokas is the very question about when, this is the machlokas, he says, between Rabbi Ami and Rabbi Ovin. Their machlokas, right, is very specifically this point about whether you're allowed to hide your identity in public. In other words, Rabbi Ami holds that it's also to say one is that a person is also to say you're not allowed to say you're a non-Jew even in order to save one's own life. To declare that one is not Jewish, right? To make that statement that one is not Jewish, he holds it's also even to save one's life. And that's why he has to explain that we're talking about a case where she is a strong woman. We cannot say that it's a scenario where where a woman would simply be able to pretend that she is a non-Jew, and that's why there's no concern of murder. He can't say that because he doesn't say that's a viable option, right? That's not a viable option. According to him, you cannot say you're not Jewish in order to save one's own life. Whereas Rabbi Ovin says it's allowed, and therefore he can explain the Mishnah as talking about a situation where a person can say that he's not Jewish. The woman can say that she's not Jewish. She can make that declaration and she would be believed because there's no physical identifying characteristics. And therefore that's why there's no concern of murder, because she can simply deny she's not Jewish. Now there's a very famous Rambam, deny that she's Jewish. There's a very famous Rambam in Igeras Hashmad. The Rambam holds that there's no Yehorig Va'al Yavro, the requirement to be killed rather than transgress doesn't apply in the case of speaking or thinking only through actions. He writes in his Igeras Hashmad, which was a letter to a whole kehillah that was under forced conversion to Islam, and he basically says if one is forced to say that one believes in Islam or subject oneself to death, as long as publicly and privately one's actions are consonant with Jewish practice, the fact that one makes a declaration to save one's life, he holds that one doesn't have to give up one's life in that situation. There is in terms of the Gemara we mentioned before, just to briefly refer back to these Gemaras before we see what the Shulchan Aruch says. There is a Rashba that says when it says about declaring that he's the servant of fire, he basically says, he gives two possible explanations. How can it be allowed to say that he's based on this certainly this Yerushalmi and those who hold that it's Yehorig Va'al Yavor to declare one is not Jewish? So how do they explain the Yerushalmi? So he says there are two ways of explaining it. Either it doesn't mean Avda Nura means a servant of the priests who worship fire. It doesn't mean that he himself, right? That he himself worships the fire. It's not saying that he's declaring he's an idolater. He's just a servant of those who that will get him off the Jewish tax, if you like, right? By saying that, yeah? Or it can also be, or it's because it's a phrase which can be understood two ways. Avdod Nura can mean a servant of our fire worshippers, but it can also mean a servant of Hashem. We describe Hashem as an Eish Oichla, as a consuming fire. So this idea of saying something that's a bit ambiguous also finds its way into the practical halacha.
Still difficult to understand how it could be Yehorig Val Yava, literally speaking.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's, I think, what the Rambam was coming to do in Igeras Hashmad. He was defending this Kehillah who had to, there was a whole Kehillah who basically had to declare their allegiance to Islam. And that is exactly what the Rambam is doing in Igeras Hashmad, right? That's exactly what he's doing. There is also a distinction, and Yosef makes a distinction between where there's a decree where Jews are ordered to wear non-Jewish clothing, right? And that could be included in this Arksod Masani, right? Even a shoelace, right? Where there's a decree specifically they should be, should wear clothing which is definitely non-Jewish. That might be Yehorig Val Yavar, but where there's a decree that all Jews should be killed, and one then disguises oneself as a non-Jew not to be swept up in that, then that would be allowed to save one's life. Let us briefly see the Shulchan Aruch, source 8. Let's see how this plays into the halacha. The Shulchan Aruch says, he says, the Shulchan Aruch holds, it's not allowed to say one is an idolater, one is a Gentile, in order to save one's life. So they won't kill him. That's what the Shulchan Aruch paskins. But if in order they shouldn't recognize that he's a Jew, he changes his clothes, right? B'shas HaGezerah, the time of the Gezerah, when they're decreeing against forbidding one to live as a Jew, and then mutter, it is allowed. So the Shulchan Aruch holds the key thing is not to say one is a Gentile. That's the key thing. That's what Shulchan Aruch says. That's not allowed, even in the situation of Yehorig Val Yavra. That's the Shulchan Aruch. The Ramah adds 2 points here, just to summarize briefly. He says, he talks about Lovish Kalam, we don't have time to go into that. Then he says that he can say something, a person is allowed to say something which can be understood two ways. Yeah, if it's vague, right? Like we saw before, where he says the servant Avdod Denura, servant of fire, could mean the servant of this idolatry, right? Or it could mean the servant of Hashem. So therefore, that would be that would be okay. And all of this, and similarly, he says that if he can trick them so they'll think he's not Jewish, then that will be okay as well. That's because that's how they'll think it. But he says all of this is only allowed b'mokum sakona. If it's not mokum sakona, so that he wants to wear non-Jewish garments so they don't recognize that he's Jewish, and simply to be able to avoid a Jewish tax, says the Ramah, it is osa, it is not allowed. On this, there is a shach, and the shach says that, there's a few things here. There's a Radvaz says that the whole discussion only applies to clothes which are specifically not Jewish, okay? Because wearing such clothing, especially in those days, would lead people to say, right, there's kofer be'ika. Yeah, he's denied the fundamentals of faith. There was specifically non-Jewish clothing. But if he uses clothing which is neutral, is not specifically Jewish, not to be non-Jewish, then he seems to say that's okay. The Shach says that although the Ramah seems to imply, or he's quoting someone else, I think, that one cannot put oneself in a situation that requires you to dress like a non-Jew. The fact is, he says, the minhag is to be lenient because one would not be able to live one's life if you had to stay at home all the time out of fear of being killed. So obviously that was in the circumstances where it would be very, very, it was very difficult even to do so. So obviously the poskim have grappled with this in difficult situations and circumstances throughout Jewish history, but it does seem to be clear from this that to directly say one is not Jewish is a real issue. Could mean Yehorig Val Yava, to declare one's identity, and there are actually chuvas about this about people who wanted to write on their documentation for visa entry to places that were hostile to Israel. Can you write on it? Can you write on it? You're not Jewish, and that's a real issue. It's a serious issue. Whereas, we've all been in situations where we want to wear a baseball cap on the tube, right? Which is not that's not a concealing of Jewish identity. That's simply neutral clothing. You're not declaring you're not Jewish. Yeah, that's not Gentile clothing either. It's like that Radvaz. Yeah. But if it's neutral clothing, yeah, that presumably would not be a problem. More to talk about, and the final source we don't have time for. It was really about that simply once. The most important thing to bear in mind when we talk about Jewish identity is bearing in mind that the way we look is the fact that we're Jewish means we have a responsibility. That people should recognize you're Jewish, what that means, what that implies, in terms of the responsibility we have. That's what it means to look Jewish in that sense. So there you go. Just a few brief ideas. Thank you for joining. I know it's brief, but I felt it was better to do 20 minutes, not take away everyone's Motzei Shabbos, and we can keep up this. Hopefully, it's only a few more weeks of this type of what should I tell you? What can I tell you? I wasn't sure this morning, but it wasn't mobbed. It wasn't mobbed.
How many people were in shul, Rabbi?
4. Me and Jeremy Reese and Pete. And Shimmy. So 2 of them were me. We were half. So Shimmy and me and Jimmy.
You had him as women.
We had him as women. Look, listen, it is what it is. It is what it is. I hopefully we will be. Hopefully, it will only be a few more weeks. Let's hope it's only 3 more Shabbosos. We're counting down. Until then, we will manage. I don't know how you want to run. We're going straight into Obus Bonim based on the schedule now.
On the email, there's a different Zoom number, so I don't know whether or not.
Is that right, Johnny? It's a different Zoom number.
Obus Bonim is never something I've really clicked with.
Let's go.
So Johnny, are we leaving here now and then going to a different number?
I think we have to. We put that on.
Where?
Okay. Maybe next time maybe we can modify for another. Okay.
It would make sense for it to be one rolling into the other.
Okay, fine, no problem. I wish you all a good Vach.
Thank you, Robert.
Those who are leaving us now will join.
Good luck.
You need.
Thank you.
You need to